So let's talk through every single unit in the Emperor's own glorious Astra Militarum, looking over their strengths and weaknesses, and a rough appraisal for how good they are in game right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard once more, and in this video I thought we'd talk through each and every single unit from Index Astra Militarum and the Forge World Index, and do a very brief general overview, a few of the positives and negatives of running them, and roughly how I'd rate them in terms of stacking up against the other units in the Index, in strong lists for the Hammer of the Emperor. The Guard definitely have a pretty enormous unit roster. There's a whole load of your datasheets within Index Astra Militarum and plenty more from Forge World, so quite a bit to get through here. I would say that Games Workshop have perhaps done better with the Guard Codex compared with several other armies out there in making most of the units at least fairly viable in-game. I'd say the vast majority of the Index is very playable at a casual level, and while Guard don't seem to be performing particularly well in-game win statistics in tournaments and things, they still seem to be a faction that can punch up with big event wins from time to time. Quite nice that there's enough depth, interest and threat in the army that, with the right list in the hands of a great player, they can still do very well. In any case, let's jump straight into it and talk through the units. We'll go through the infantry first, then the tanks and vehicles, then go through the various characters, officers and leaders of the guard, and finish up with the Forge World datasheets. First up, let's take a look at the battle line troops. First up, we have the standard infantry squad, a 60-point battle line infantry choice, getting you 10 guardsmen, though 2 of them would usually be organised into a heavy weapon team. Guard infantry is at least fairly good value, cheap and flexible with orders, getting you a lot of objective control, and if the enemy decides to push against them too much, they can hit back with perhaps some slightly surprising damage with special weapons, and at least take a little bit of focus fire to kill due to weight of numbers. The infantry squads have got very good access to character attachments, and the standard infantry squad perhaps more so than most. And for the actual infantry squad datasheet itself, the big draws are the heavy weapon that you get in the unit. Having a las cannon hidden in each guard unit certainly doesn't hurt, or a mortar could be handy enough to do some chip damage if they are just going to be hiding. And the infantry squad datasheet also gets cover on objectives as well. If you use the order for +1 to their saves, it means that they can be surprisingly hard to take down. I feel like they may be seen as a little bit niche, maybe compared with Deathcore Krieg if you want a fair bunch of infantry to move up the board and deal some damage with special weapons. Possibly worth the extra 5 points there, though if you want just guys to hold down home field objectives and provide a bit of fire support, they kind of do a fine job. I'd rate them a 7 out of 10. Otherwise, for the infantry squad variants, the Acadian shock troops are also 60 points. They come with the sticky objectives, objective secured sort of special rule. Definitely handy enough to have on troops units. Means that if they're shot down at long range, then you still hold the objective. I'd still say that maybe they're the most niche out of the regular infantry squad variants though, lacking a bit of the special weapons and the regeneration that the Krieg Meg Pack can bring. Not as cheap as the Kathchans if you want frontline infantry, and the Scout's keyword is a big advantage for a squad to be pushing forward like these guys usually want to, and maybe locked out of a few other characters due to being Acadian datasheet. I still say they're pretty usable to escort certain characters, say Ursula Creed. I've chosen to rate them a 7 out of 10 here, though I feel like they are maybe the most eclipsed infantry squad variant compared with the rest. Speaking of the Deathcore Krieg a couple of times, they're 65 points for a unit of 10 of them, or 130 per 20. Certainly early in the edition, it was kind of fashionable to run big blocks of 20 of these, maybe with a Psycho for an invulnerable save and a Field Marshal for a 5+ feel no pain. And then you've got a unit that's surprisingly dangerous with 3 special weapons that get some big +1 to hit and wound buffs as the squad takes damage. Revives miniatures with the med pack hidden within the squad, and then a big squad of 20 could have 6 special weapons in it, between plasma melter and grenade launchers. As with the other infantry squads that I hadn't mentioned, they are a pretty good target for the reinforcement stratagem if you're using squads of 20, and I feel like if you're trying to make foot guard work with units with a fair bit of core damage output, then these guys are probably going to be a datasheet that you'd want to take. They do have quite a lot of draws even if they are a little bit more expensive. As for weaknesses, if you are trying to use them as infantry damage dealers, then even just tagging them in melee will stop their shooting, which is kind of depressing. And even with the abundance of special weapons, they still need orders, and for the enemy to be kind of close for their damage to really shine. Plus being Krieg, while you can have the Field Marshal join, you can't get the Cadian or Kathchan characters to join. Overall, I've chosen to give them an 8 out of 10. Might be being a little bit generous here, could have been a 7 perhaps, but I think they're quite fun if you are trying to build around infantry damage dealers. Finally, for the more standard battle line infantry are the Kathchan Jungle Fighters, 55 points per unit, the cheapest guardsmen out there, so kind of the toughest per point for that reason. They get scouts, so are quite nice for putting objective control 2 bodies into the midfield, have a couple of flamers for skirmishing with lighter infantry, and get a small melee boost. Now they are a little bit cheaper compared with the other infantry squad variants. They actually seem to be one of the most commonly played infantry squads competitively. Just having a bunch of infantry in the midfield all the way from turn 1 is quite nice, and they can pair quite well with heavy flamer chimeras to have them move up and be quite a good skirmish unit. They are a unit that can use Iron Hand Strachan as well, and he is kind of great for the 55 points, making them into an actual dangerous melee threat. For downsides, their damage output is much worse than the other infantry squads. The Flamers will be good against light infantry, but not anything with good saves. I feel like their close combat melee buff is perhaps a bit disappointing. They're definitely a long way from the previous combos that you could do with them to make them punch extra hard. Still though, really quite a solid high objective control screening unit. I'd rate them an 8 out of 10. Next up, for some veteran infantry, we have the Acadian Kazakin, 100 points for a unit of 10 of these guys, bringing quite a lot of ballistic skill 3+ special weapons in the unit, often melter guns, plasma guns, the hotshot marksman rifle, and the hotshot regular rifles, and between all that, they're at least fairly scary to medium or heavy infantry. The melter mine is quite a good nice to have as well, as is a solid charge deterrent for mortal wounds, particularly against vehicles. Scout 6 inches could also allow them to take up some nice positions in the midfield to punish the enemy if they're advancing, and to jump out and hit them with lots of special weapon fire. Their special rule is to be able to declare an order themselves in the command phase. Stacking multiple orders between these guys and say Ursula Creed could be really quite scary. You could have them move fast with move, 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 and also hit quite hard, or potentially flex into the +1 to saves while they're in cover. And they're another interesting choice from reinforcements, with their special rule meaning they could declare an order while off the board. You could be turning up from the flanks with a bunch of melter guns and plasma guns all hitting on a 2+ if you wanted. I'd say the main downside is how easy they are to kill despite their 4+ carapace armor. Ideally, they definitely want to be getting the first damage strike on the enemy and not the other way around, and want to play safe with cover. They are also kind of close range for their maximal effectiveness as well. They'd want to be getting within 12 inches for rapid fire plasma and melter guns if they could. Still though, at the moment they're really quite a commonly played competitive unit, quite a lot of threat to them for guard infantry. I've chosen to rate them a 9 out of 10 here. Next up we have the elite soldiers dropping in from the skies and the Tempestus Scions. They're 55 points for 5 miniatures, and are quite nice just as they're very cheap units to deep strike to do secondaries or actions and objectives and things, and can provide a little bit of pinpoint special weapon firepower with things like plasma guns or melter guns. The Power Fist also means they aren't completely worthless in melee as well, and they do get quite a nice boost getting 2 V-roll hit rolls against enemies on objectives, so are fairly punchy against clearing things like standard Space Marines off there. They might be just a little bit more interesting as actual damage dealers now that you can do orders after you've set up from reserves. Could make building around them a little bit more interesting. For negatives, with mid-strength, plasma and melter guns, the way they deliver them, it's just not really all that great, and they do need to be very close to deliver it. Like the Kazakin, they're just very fragile as well after they have made their alpha strike, and are likely to be able to be taken down by the enemy fairly easily. Still though, for 55 points, they're really quite cheap and pretty nice just for scoring points, maybe doing a little bit of damage as a bonus. I've chosen to rate them a 7 out of 10 here, often seen in competitive lists and small numbers for objective scoring. You could do some quirky builds building around them. Next up we have the Hulking Ogrins, 65 points for 3 of them. I feel like their datasheet's really quite interesting, potentially getting a big 6 shots at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2, if you can deliver those Ripper guns into within 9-inch range, and that kind of firepower is pretty terrifying to things like standard Space Marines. If they charge in, they've got a bit of strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1 melee to back it up, so can handle themselves a bit there, though it's nowhere near as fearsome as their shooting. And for the just over 20 points per model, I'd say their durability is alright, toughness 6 and a 6+ feel no pain, but not a good save. I've seen occasionally people using these with some big fun super heavy transport, where you can transport loads of them within one unit, and either fire out the firing deck for AP1 or jump out for more. If the stars align for them and they get to shoot against an optimal target, they could really punch up well. For downsides, they are quite short ranged and really quite slow. Just slogging up the board does mean that they'll probably be taking firepower, and while they are not standout weak, just about any sort of shooting in the game will take chunks out of them, whether it's small arms or anti-tank firepower, which isn't really the best place to be in. Otherwise their damage output really drops off against anything toughness 6 or higher, which isn't ideal. They can't get orders from most units, and perhaps just being overshadowed by Bulgrin is their biggest issue. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. Definitely very interesting, but maybe just a bit clunky to deliver to the extent where you might not want to bother with them as much as other things. Next up, we have the Bulgrins, 80 points for a unit of 3 of the Cybernetic Ogrin. These guys are 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ invulnerable save, a -1 damage, and a 6+ feel no pain, so a whole bunch of barriers to damage there. The invulnerable and the -1 damage makes them just spectacularly more tough than the Ogrin are. Their damage comes from a whole load of math, strength 7, AP -1, and damage 2 attacks, and they could potentially get some melee orders broadcast from Lord Solar or move potentially. Just in general, these guys seem to be pretty excellent for being a big durable unit to hold down the midfield and battle against enemy infantry. With their defensive profile, most enemy units are going to be having to expend a lot of resources if they want to take down these models, which is exactly the sort of thing that you want on the front line. Just any sort of melee in a guard army is kind of nice to have as well. Good to be able to have a countercharge threat. For downsides, they are a little bit slow moving. Their objective control is a little bit low for taking the midfield points. They might have certain things stolen out from under them. And the strength 7 and AP -1 profile does mean that there's lots of things that just don't really care that much against their damage output. Things like Terminators with 2+ saves, or anything toughness 8 or more, they'll only really be scratching it as opposed to just wiping them out. They can definitely bully a lot of more normal sized infantry though. Overall, they're making loads of appearances in competitive lists, are generally considered a nice unit to have stomping up towards the front line to take the midfield, and I'd rate them a 9 out of 10. Next up, we have the diminutive Abhuman Ratlings, 60 points for a unit of 5 of them, a cheap unit of infiltrators for screening and having some midfield presence, and then they could use their move, shoot, move trick to either just get very quickly across the board, moving at essentially 12 inches per turn, or ping in and out of cover so they can pop out, shoot something, and then hide safe once more. Their sniper fire, I think, is enough to threaten lighter characters, certainly anything that's got toughness 3 and maybe 4 wounds or less. A lucky volley from these guys could risk taking one of those out. For the downsides, they are very easy to kill with just toughness 2 and a 6+ save. Not exactly the first choice of profile that I'd want on the front line infiltrating up the board. They would even have to fear Overwatch from fairly tame enemy units to bump off a whole bunch of them, even if they were doing their move, shoot, move thing. I'd say at 60 points for that kind of profile, they're perhaps just a little bit on the pricey side for what they do, or paying quite a lot for their move, shoot, move and their sniper fire. Overall, probably not a unit that I'd go too heavy on. Overall, though, I think it's interesting to have units to start in the midboard. I've chosen to rate them a 7 out of 10 here. Next up, for 35 points, we have the Militarum Servitors. 35 points for a unit of 4 of these, the cheapest infantry units that the guard can field at that cost, and cheap units definitely have their advantages, being able to screen or put them in strategic reserve to do secondaries, even if they do have objective control 0, which means they're not going to be helping out holding primaries or anything like that. Their damage output isn't great, but they do have a couple of multi-melters and some damage 3 servo arms. Their weapon skill and ballistic skill is really quite terrible. But if they do roll a couple of lucky hits, then they could actually do some surprising damage to something important. You could also use them with a regimental engines here to make a surprisingly big and chunky infantry unit, maybe alongside a command squad and any other attachments that they have. You could get an infantry squad unit up to 30+ models if you wanted. I think perhaps their biggest weakness though is that for their cheap utility sort of role, you can get other cheap units out there. The Inquisitorial Henchmen are 40 points, are generally tougher and have some objective control. I feel like I'd be tempted to take them over these guys for the utility screening sort of role. And Guard do have plenty of other fairly cheap infantry units like the Kazachan Jungle Fighters, which do a lot more. Even with their heavy weapons, the damage and defense are really quite bad per point. I've chosen to rank them a 4 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got infantry with big guns. First up, the trusty heavy weapon squad. 60 points for a unit of 3 bases of these. You can get some fairly cheap las cannons on the go at 20 points per las cannon shot, though if you're using them for direct fire, they do die to a stiff breeze, which does limit their utility there. I'd say probably the most interesting way to use them would be a squad of 3 mortars, which puts out a fair amount of stacked saves on the enemy between born soldiers, and having 3 copies of the blast rule, which should get you a lot more shots against bigger stacked up enemy infantry units. I believe their numbers do outcompete the Wyverns slightly there. Their main weakness is just how fragile and immobile they are if they want to have good damage output. It seems that even with indirect firepower being quite so important, they don't seem to make the cut with most army lists at the moment, and if the enemy can get line of sight on them or a small amount of indirect fire, they'll probably make short work of them. and being a small unit they're kind of inefficient for certain synergies like having orders thrown at them, and the Overwatch special rule is still going to be a bit questionable given that you have to spend a command point on a very tiny unit to activate it. Overall, with the mortars, I'd still say they're not terrible though. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. Could be alright sitting on a home field objective, throwing a whole bunch of shots towards the enemy's light infantry and trying to whittle away at their objective holders. Otherwise, their counterparts are the field ordnance batteries, 120 points for a squad of 2 of them. I feel like these guys are maybe paying for the artillery premium for their bombast field guns, which means that the las cannons and the missile launchers got increased in cost, though not really needing it. The bombast guns each strike with d6 shots at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2. Having just a bit of indirect fire is really quite helpful, being able to whittle away at units on objectives, or take out fragile damage dealers, or just chip into anything that's injured. The strength 7 and AP -1 is maybe a little bit mid though. If the enemy unit's got a good save, then they're going to be saving quite reliably against these. Otherwise, out of the other 2 options, the las cannons would be my other favourite one. They'd have 4 shots total between the 2 of them at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6 +1. Pretty good against big toughness 12 or higher vehicles in particular. If they're static and they get ordered, then they get sustained hits 1, which is nice. At least compared with the heavy weapon platform, they're tougher than those when they are directly shot at, though still aren't as tough compared with big tanks with big guns. Overall, for their weapon types, I feel like the bombast field guns perhaps aren't quite as standout compared with things like Medusa carriages or basilisks. The extra strength and AP that they get is rather good, and for the direct fire guns like the las cannons, their damage output isn't bad, but tanks do have significant advantages, both being tougher and more mobile than these guys. Overall, between all that, I rate them as a bit middling. I've chosen to score them a 6 out of 10 here. Next up, let's talk about the mounted units from the core index, the Attila and Rough Riders. 70 points per 5 of them, or 140 per 10. They move fast with a 12-inch move, and could use move to get even faster, and their special rule allows them to ignore modifiers to their movement characteristic, so you're not going to hold them up. Their melee damage is at least fairly flexible, having the option for the lance melee with either a bunch of strength 4 attacks or the melter lances at strength 9. Having a few melee units in guard is pretty handy for a little bit of countercharge threat to punish enemies that are overeager to get to grips with your tanks, and these guys have a few other advantages in having las guns and the option to fall back and charge if needed. For weaknesses, I'd say perhaps their biggest one is that 2 wound models at toughness 4 with a 4+ save aren't really all that hard to kill, and being mounted units, they're going to have to go around terrain, so are quite likely to be taking enemy firepower. If the opponent has a few heavy bolters to throw at them, you're going to lose a good chunk of the unit. Still though, maybe not awful to have as a countercharge threat. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10 here. I'd probably go sparing in small numbers though, and stick to terrain. Moving on to the vehicles and motor pool of the Guard Index next, and first we have Scout Sentinels. They're 60 points each as a walker vehicle unit, and these guys just have a whole ton of advantages. They're really tough for the cost, even the Scout variant. 7 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save is great durability. They can scout 9 inches into the midfield and make themselves a problem or a move blocking nuisance if they want to. The buff that they hand out is some pretty phenomenal added value. Reroll hit rolls of 1 for a unit that you're targeting, and also getting to ignore the hit penalty for indirect fire is rather nice. It does mean that you might want to field them individually, as then you could have that boost on multiple different units. For firepower, they get a las cannon and a hunter killer missile, so your opponent can't rely on them doing absolutely nothing, and even if they get charged and tied up in combat, they might chip away an infantry or 2 with their chainsaw. Regiment and squadron are handy enough, which means they can get orders from all sorts of things, plus it also means they can use reinforcements as well. That might be a bit more efficient if they're being fielded in a big chunky unit as opposed to individuals. For their weaknesses, despite las cannons and things, their damage output still is pretty low. You don't really want to overinvest in them too much, I'd say. And low objective control means that while it might be able to reach midfield objectives, it might find itself outcompeted by cheap enemy infantry to take those points, so not exactly very reliable in holding primaries alone. Still though, I'd say that for the 60 points it brings some massive value. I've scored it a 9 out of 10 here. Their more heavily armoured plated cousins, the Armoured Sentinels, are good as well I think. They're 10 points more at 70 points each, and for that upgrade they lose utility but get another interesting special rule and do get tougher. They're 7 wounds at toughness 8 with a 2+ save now. Again, just spectacularly tanky for how many points you pay. The armoured version loses a bit of movement, doesn't get scouts, and doesn't get the rather godly buffing rule that the Scout Sentinel gets, but it does get a damage boost against enemy monsters and vehicles, being able to reroll wound rolls against them, which is quite nice with las cannons and the hunter killer missiles if they want to do a bit of early game tank hunting. If you can have a big unit of them marching up the board and force your opponent to deal with them early, they're really quite a nice unit to recycle with reinforcements. A unit of 210 points of these I think is the biggest value that you can get out of the reinforcement stratagem. Whenever these guys get recycled for 2 command points, it's pretty crazy that you can get another 21 wounds worth of Sentinel march onto the board, hunter killer missiles reinstated. Still though, they do have the weakness of having very low damage output compared with other vehicles and things out there. They've still got low objective control like the scouts. I would say that for a big distraction unit of these guys, they're pretty good as a reinforcement target. I've chosen to score them an 8 out of 10 overall. Next up, let's get into some of the iconic tanks in the Imperial Guard, and start out with the various variants of the Leman Russ. The standard workhorse of the Imperial Guard are at least fairly tough with 13 wounds and a 2+ armor save, pretty firmly putting them in the place where you need high AP anti-tank firepower to bring them down. I'd say perhaps their toughness 11 though does put them in the awkward spot of being wounded on 3+ by las cannons and quite a lot of other most common anti-tank weapons out there. The different variants all have their own special rules and turrets that I'll talk about in a second, but besides that, they get some quite nice weapons to back it up. Likely a hull-mounted las cannon, and then some sponsored multi-melters tend to be the most common choice, plus a hunter killer missile and a heavy stubber on the pintle. They do get quite an impressive amount of secondary weapons. They can get some solid value from tank orders. I'll mention the Tank Commander 2 in this section, and the sheer number of data sheets that you can get for them does mean that they can be spammed. For weaknesses, their ballistic skill 4+ can be an issue if they aren't under orders, as that means that they could be hitting on a 5+ if the enemy's got stealth or anything. Probably the biggest issue of the class as a whole though is competition with Rogue Dawns and Beyblade variants, both of which seem to be quite a lot better balanced against the Russes this time around. And within the Russ variants, there's definitely a fair few that are played a bit more than others. Getting into them though, the standard battle tank is 180 points. A strength 10 AP1 and damage 3 battle cannon is fairly general purpose, has fairly good range even if it isn't quite as great as it was, now it's down to 48 inches, and its special rule is big rerolls to hit against enemies on objectives, which can work for its other weapons as well. That can be quite meaningful when applies to multi-melters and las cannons and things. Probably the biggest downside I think is its AP-1 on the big gun. It means that certain targets just don't care that much about that. Say Space Marine Dreadnoughts in cover would still be saving on a 2+ unless you've got any other buffs going. It does mean that if you do have a lot of them as well, the opponents might well just decide to make sure that any particularly heavy hitters that they think that are going to get shot could just not be on objectives and leave the objective holding to grunts or things that are better hidden. Still though, definitely not awful as a generalist, still very threatening to a number of targets, particularly on objective points. I've chosen to rate this one a 7 out of 10. Next up is the cheapest variant in the Leman Russ Vanquisher. This one's 155 points, and it does have the dangerous but very gloriously swingy Vanquisher cannon. Hitting on a 3+ if it's static, strength 18, AP4 and a big damage D6+6, getting a V-roll to wound against enemy vehicles. I feel like if this was costed the same as most variants, I would have raised it very low indeed, but at 155 points, that is the cheapest Russ chassis that you can get. The gun might be ridiculously swingy, and its very specific purpose, not really helping you out against heavy infantry too much, but at least you're getting it for quite cheap. One other small issue with the gun is that if you fire at something with an invulnerable save, it makes the value of a command point reroll just extra high. Say if someone fails a 4+ invulnerable, then they're going to try and reroll it if they have the option to, and that could potentially lead to a bit of disappointment. Overall tends to be one of the slightly lesser played variants, though I still don't think is dreadful now it dropped in cost this much. I've chosen to rate it a 6 out of 10. Maybe in a similar sort of boat for different reasons is the Leman Russ Punisher, 160 points, so it's still a very cheap variant. This one gets the Punisher Gatling cannon for a big 20 strength 6 shots at AP0, but can get devastating wounds against things that aren't monsters or vehicles. Unsurprisingly, it is the most efficient Russ against lighter infantry, though it's kind of mediocre to bad against everything else. I feel like perhaps the biggest downside to this guy is that the Guard don't generally need the help against light infantry quite so much. They tend to have quite a lot of things that are just incidentally very good against those. So often on Russ turrets, people tend to look for things that can at least handle things like, say, Terminators or light vehicles, or do so a bit better than the Punisher at least. Overall, I've chosen to rate it a 6 out of 10. It does also have the disadvantage of being quite short-ranged at 24 inches as well. The other short-ranged Russ that is a fair bit more dangerous though is the Lehman Russ Demolisher. This one the most expensive standard version of the Russ at 200 points. Despite the price premium, it does still work out as generally the best overall damage output against big heavy things, and compared with the Lehman Russ Vanquisher is just far more flexible against medium infantry or heavy infantry compared with the single shot that gets. I do quite like the way that it's got its fire in melee bonus as well, where you get to ignore big guns never tire and fire blast into combat. It's definitely a possibility that this guy could wind up in combat given that it needs to get close on the front line. For downsides, being the most expensive Russ means it pays the most for the same defensive profile. The range is short and it could get outranged, at least in early turns, on things that the enemy wants to keep back. And perhaps the biggest argument against the Lehman Russ Demolisher at the moment with the points cost is that you could just get a tank commander for 5 points more, and typically that does seem to be a worthwhile trade-off. Overall, I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10. I still think it's fine and would see more play if the tank commander was pointed differently. The Demolisher cannon still lives up to its fearsome name. Next up, there's the Lehman Russ Eradicator, 160 points for the ignores cover infantry killing gun. Compared with a standard battle cannon, it gets a higher rate of fire and gets to ignore cover, but it does take the massive hit compared with the standard Russ of dropping down from strength 10 and damage 3 to strength 7 and damage 2, which is a huge hit. Its special rule is the same sort of firing combat boost that the Lehman Russ Demolisher gets. I would say it's perhaps a little bit less important than that one, given that its gun just isn't quite as general purpose to be able to handle tough stuff that target in combat. For downsides, its damage output is kind of super weak against anything that's at least fairly tough. And I feel like if I was thinking about taking this one, then a bunch of the other variants for a few more points would well be worth it. Say just the Lehman Russ Executioner for the non-overcharged modes to get a bunch of AP2 shooting, never mind the option to overcharge for damage 3. Or the higher strength damage and big rerolls of the standard battle tank. It is cheaper though, and I feel like it's not really all that much further behind if you take into account the points difference. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10 here, but I feel like given the points it maybe isn't the biggest downgrade as it might look on paper if you wanted a Russ that's maybe a bit more expendable on the front lines. I think if I was going for a cheap one though, I'd still be more tempted by the enormous hit or miss Vanquisher. At least the main gun every so often will do something phenomenal, even if it'll spend a lot of the time letting you down. Next up, there's the Lehman Russ Executioner, 180 points for the Plasma Cannon Lehman Russ. This one gives you a bunch of Strength 7 and AP2 Damage 2 firepower, or overcharge to Strength 8, AP3 and Damage 3. Its special rule is a slightly niche one with a +1 to hit below half strength enemies. Kind of situational, but every so often it might help out. This one is the Russ that you want for taking out heavy infantry like Terminators or Space Marines with its good AP. It's really quite good for its role, though it is a fair bit less standout against toughness 9 or higher, though it at least threatens them a little bit better than some like the Eradicator. The overheats on the plasma gun on the top could also cause it some damage itself with the hazardous rolls as well. Could be fairly painful if you do get unlucky with a couple of them. Overall though, I'd rate it as solidly usable. I've chosen to rank it a 7 out of 10 here. Next up for 180 points is the Lehman Russ Exterminator. This one kind of feels like it's got a lot of similar sort of trade-offs with the standard Lehman Russ battle tank. The Exterminator autocannons have a few trade-offs with that, getting a bunch more shots within 24 inches and being a bit tamer out to the 48, and it gets innate twin links, but doesn't get the rerolls that the standard battle cannon Russ does against things on objectives. Perhaps one of the biggest selling points for this guy though is that when you shoot something with the autocannons, you get extra AP against that unit for the rest of the shooting phase, which could be a big boost to the rest of the army trying to focus fire. For that reason, I'd say it's interesting enough to have one of these in the army, though I probably wouldn't go for more. I feel like the way that the debuff is handed out is perhaps a little bit unhelpful as well, as the thing that you want to ruin the armor save of might not really be the same thing that you want to fire the autocannon profile at. You kind of want the debuff on things with very high saves, whereas the AP-1 autocannon you probably don't really want to be shooting at the highest save thing that the enemy has. Still though, interesting enough, I've chosen to rate it an 8 out of 10. Finally, for the many flavours of Russes, we have the Lehman Russ Tank Commander. This one's a character vehicle, so could be given enhancements, and it's 205 points, so very slightly more than the Demolisher, and having the same defensive profile it does mean that it's got the worst durability for the points. In general, I'd be tempted to give these Demolisher cannons, given that you're paying the price tag for a gun that expensive, so you may as well use it. Beyond that, it gets 2 extra special rules, giving a tank order to a model within 12 inches, though it can't order itself, And then in my opinion really quite a nice special rule, shooting on death, counting as 4 wounds remaining on a 2+ when it's slain. That can be really quite a big blitz of damage when it goes out, essentially making it kind of likely that you get another shooting phase out of this, and often in the enemy's turn after they've exposed key units to do damage themselves. In theory, a weakness should be that it can't get orders very easily, but you can get orders broadcast to them over a Master Vox with Lord Solar, so that's not really as big of an issue. Overall, it does seem to be a very competitive unit, and they seem to crop up in more competitive lists than they don't. Fairly scary to have a Demolisher Cannon profile that can threaten to fire if the enemy destroys it, and also helps out other units in your army by giving them orders, making them faster or more dangerous. Overall very scary. I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10. Next up, and the new tank on the block, is the Rogel Dawn Battle Tank, 260 points, and a big chunky and intimidating tank to try and gun down, toughness 12, 18 wounds, and it's got its special rule of a once per game flip a damage to 0, though kind of annoyingly it's done once the attack is allocated to the model as opposed to after you've failed saves, so it makes sense to do it on something that's really high AP and high damage. Still though, it's going to need a lot of dedicated anti-tank fire to bring one of these down, and it's quite easy to get cover. And then you've got a great big rolling battle fortress with a scary oppressor cannon, lightly backed up by the high AP pulverizer cannon, some multi-melter sponsons, and either a bunch of stubbers or more melter guns. Being a big high investment tank, it's quite good for any focal buffs that can affect it, say stratagems or Lord Solar's orders, or maybe a regimental engine seer. They're even harder to take out with a 4+ invulnerable save and restoring their wounds. Ideally, with such a high investment thing, you probably want it to screen out from nuisance charges, and not have it to make painful decisions as to whether or not it falls back from things or takes hit penalties, and given that it's quite such a big and beefy tank, it's harder to hide behind terrain than most, and might be a little bit trickier to manoeuvre around big terrain pieces, and it won't fit through certain narrow gaps. Overall, with all its guns and threat added up, it does seem to be really quite a popular choice, tending to be run more commonly than the regular Rosses that aren't tank commanders, a staple of competitive army lists. I've chosen to rate it a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Baneblade chassis variants. Technically 8 different variants plus the Forge World Stormblade, I suppose. Though I thought for this video I'll just cover them with the one slide here. Just maybe doesn't feel like there's quite as much value as going through them individually compared with the Lehman Rosses. In any case, as a class, the Index ones cost between 440 and 495 points, though the Forge World Stormblade is significantly cheaper for some reason, down at 445. And in 10th edition, Games Workshop does seem to have them in actually a surprisingly good place. Very tanky and hard to take down with toughness 13, their 2+ armor save, and 24 wounds. That's more than several armies can handle, even if some armies will have the sheer amount of anti-tank to take them out. Even if they do, they might still wind up finding themselves in a place where they're left or last just out of necessity, so can often have a fair bit of the game shooting. Even more so than the Rogel Dawn and things, they're a big scary focal unit for any buffs or stratagems that can affect them. Lord Solar's orders and the invulnerable save from an engine seer seem like very tempting includes if you are bringing one of these monsters along. You just get very big value out of any one of those when it's applied to this many wounds of tank and gun. The big gun at the top can be tailored to target depending on the variant that you take, whether it's the slightly more anti-infantry Hellhammer and the Stormlord versus things like the more general purpose big hitting Baneblade, Banehammer and Doomhammer and things, and then you get backed up by a whole bunch of sponsored las cannons, twin heavy bolters, various hull mounted guns. A couple of them, like the Baneblade and the Hellhammer, have a demolisher cannon as well, which is pretty significant extra value. A few of the variants also come with some transport capacity, which is nice. It can be kind of cool for certain party boss tactics, like having a whole bunch of Ogrins hiding in there to jump out and unleash their Ripper guns. Those slightly fun and zany all-in tactics can be quite cool. I think out of the variants, maybe my favourites might be the Banesword, Baneblade, and the Stormblade perhaps. Just quite a nice mix of guns for their cost, fairly effective both against heavy infantry and against heavy tanks. I do quite like the armour obliteration rule that the Banesword gets. The chance to detonate enemy vehicles with deadly demise could actually be surprisingly brutal in the heart of an enemy army. Maybe one of the single best special rules that the Baneblade chassis gets. On the downsides, with just a ridiculously enormous metal box of a vehicle, it can be very tricky to manoeuvre around terrain. You're unlikely to be able to hide them at all, and then particularly on boards that have some sort of set terrain layout, they might not be able to get through certain gaps in ruins and things, unless you deliberately set up the table to be able to accommodate them. For that reason, they often just do better in formats that allow them to pass or have player-placed terrain. and occasionally people do seem to have good success at big tournaments bringing one of these along. They're more commonly in player-placed terrain events, things where you know that they'll be able to get to certain positions on the board and make themselves threatening. Otherwise, for downsides, I guess there's the possibility that they just get somewhat ignored and their damage just dealt with while they focus on the entirety of the rest of your army, and the native ballistic skill 4+ can be bad unless you have Lord Solar there to order them. Plus there's the competition with all the smaller tanks out there, such as Russes and Dawns, which might be able to bring their firepower to more focused areas of the table and not be quite such a big all-or-nothing type thing. Still though, they're far more viable than they've been at many times in the past. I've chosen to rank the Baneblade variants on the whole a 7 out of 10. I certainly rate a few of them perhaps a little bit higher or a little bit lower than that, depending on the specific datasheet though. Next up, we've got the Anti-Air Hydra, 110 points for a Chimera chassis with a bunch of autocannons that get Anti-Fly 2+, and also reroll hits against fly units with its Strength 9, AP 1 and Damage 3 twin-linked autocannons. As it goes, compared with bigger investment guard vehicles, it is fairly cheap and expendable for what it does. I think its main issue though is that its damage output just really isn't all that great. The AP-1 really limits it against certain flyers that it might want to take down. And it just neither really has a particularly impressive main gun nor good special weapons to back it up. I'd say for the most part you're going to be better with most of the other vehicles in the guard motor pool compared with the Hydra, unfortunately. I think it gets to okay against fly units, but if your opponent doesn't have any of those, it's going to be super bad. Overall I've chosen to rate it a 4 out of 10. Next we've got the Hellhound for 125 points. It's fairly durable at 11 wounds and a 2+ save, a bit more up-armoured compared with how it's been in the past. It's maybe most interesting as an Overwatch threat that's strongly linked towards the midfield, an Inferno cannon plus maybe a heavy flamer on the whole. You could swap out that heavy flamer for a multi-melter if you wanted some dedicated anti-tank as opposed to being Overwatch heavy. Its special rule means that you get to flush enemy units out of cover. Can be handy if you're fighting against a big vehicle with some high saves and it happens to be in cover. That could help out the rest of your firepower a little bit, particularly in combination with other AP debuff things. Overall though, for 125 points, I don't really rate the damage output all that much, and I feel like the Devil Dog and Bane Wolf variants don't improve on that. I think if you want a skirmishing in the middle of the board Overwatch type threat, you might just be better off with a double heavy flamer Chimera plus some Catachans inside it. You can get that particular loadout for 125 points, and it's just more annoying to deal with. Generally would deal more damage and has better objective control once the infantry get out. Just feels like I'd rather have that sort of formation for the same points cost. Overall I've chosen to rank the Hellhound a 6 out of 10, maybe not unusable but not quite as standout as most of the rest. Next up we've got the great big cruise missile on a tractor that is the Death Strike. 160 points for the great big vortex missile sitting in the corner of the board. It works by declaring a token marker somewhere on the board, then your opponent has a turn to hurriedly scurry out the way if they want to be, and then each next turn you can either choose to redeclare the token or launch the missile. You hit each unit within 6 inches for a big 2d6, strength 16, AP 4 and damage 1 hits, which does mean that if you could get that off on multiple different units then you could do a fair bit of damage. Though given that things can move out the way, I feel like perhaps its best value is more in just being able to scatter enemy castles, say for example declaring it on a big vital ruin where half their army wanted to hide in. They'd have to make their units think twice about whether or not they're going to stay castled up there, or go running out of it and face the rest of your guns of your army. Unfortunately, I feel like in 10th edition the numbers for the Death Strike just don't really add up quite as well as they did briefly in 9th edition. If the opponent really cares about their damage output, then they can usually move any one thing out the way. And against certain units, it's not really quite so ruinous that the opponent might necessarily 100% care about moving a squad out the way. If you just had a squad of cheap cultists holding an objective, they could just stay put. If the Death Strike player chooses to actually launch the missile, then they might not kill even the entire squad. Overall, just a bit too costly for 160 points, I think. I've chosen to rank it a 3 out of 10. Next up, for 110 points, there's the Wyvern, the anti-infantry artillery piece with fairly effective barrage fire against light infantry, a bunch of twin-linked ignores cover, strength 5 and AP 0 shots. As with other artillery pieces, it makes good use of born soldiers for the odd auto wounds. It can stay hidden while it threatens that, so it's quite nice not having to worry too much about its durability at all. And Guard as an army has plenty of indirect fire buffs available to it. If it hits a unit, then it can debuff something for a -1 to hit if it isn't a monster or vehicle. While it is cheap, its damage output I still think leaves a lot to be desired. It's just not great against anything besides the lightest of infantry. Even standard Space Marines will have a good chance of shrugging off its damage fairly easily. And the Guard do have a lot more threatening indirect fire weapons, such as the Basilisk or maybe the Medusa carriage right now, which are a lot more general purpose and get a bit more AP and damage. Overall, I've chosen to rank the Wyvern a 5 out of 10. Indirect fire is good, but this one's not really seen one of the more optimal ones. Speaking of the Basilisk, it's 135 points for d6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP 2, and damage 2. Quite a few shots, hits on a 4 plus with a heavy keyword, which is kind of handy, and it's particularly good at killing things like standard Space Marines, wounding them on a 2 plus with a bit more AP than some. Fairly general purpose indirect fire is just fairly handy to have, putting finishing blows on objective scorers, destroying fragile damage dealers, and being about as flexible as anything on the table to declare at the end of the shooting phase. A Basilisk or 2 hiding in your own deployment zone is pretty nice, and it also gets a very nice big movement debuff for a -2 to move, advance, and charge. That could be enough to keep a slow melee infantry unit out of the fight for an extra turn and could cause some big problems. For downsides, its damage output is low against anything that's T9 or above, and its actual damage output doesn't compare amazingly to actual direct fire damage, but that's kind of expected given that you can put it exactly where you need it. And the Basilisk does have some advantages compared with the other good indirect fire support of the Guard. Compared with the Forge World artillery carriages, it's tougher with its tank profile and can also move. Overall, really quite a strong unit, not really the worst to have 1 or 2 for the debuff and the indirect. I've scored it a 9 out of 10 here. Next up, and bringing a whole load of Storm Eagle rockets to the table, is the Manticore. 180 points for d6 plus 3, strength 10, AP 2, and damage 3 shots, a fair bit more threatening for killing things like Terminators or medium vehicles, and it also gets to reroll hit rolls against units of 5 or more, making it really quite good for hunting heavy infantry. Unfortunately, this thing did get a fairly punitive nerf from Games Workshop recently, going all the way up to 180 points from 150, which I think really took the shine off a fairly good unit for the Guard. Even with the power of indirect fire and the various artillery-related buffs that Guard can get, things like Scout Sentinels or overlapping fields. Overall, I feel like it's probably a bit behind things like the Basilisk and the Medusa carriage now, though still definitely isn't too bad for a high investment artillery piece, just to put a bit of that scary damage exactly where needed. I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10, far more borderline than it was before, though definitely still has some value, and I don't think it's unplayable or anything. Leaving artillery behind, next we have a few transport vehicles. The Chimera is 70 points, and it is a tough, cheap transport for the cost. Its durability is really stand out for all the wounds that you get on the board at that price. It does actually have some fairly good damage output against light infantry, potentially with double heavy flamers, stubbers, lasgun arrays, and a hunter-killer missile. It's more threat than you might expect for a transport vehicle, and could definitely bully other enemy scoring units. It also has firing deck too, so you might be able to contribute a little bit of firepower with units within. Otherwise, officers can issue orders as a mobile command bunker. Plus, has now also changed the rules so that officers that disembark can order after doing so, which is pretty massive. It does seem to pair particularly nicely with Katachan jungle fighters for the scouts keywords to get these annoying chimeras right into the midfield early and lay claim to the midfield points. For downsides, generally transport damage is still fairly poor on the whole. It'll do okay against lighter things, but anything Space Marine toughness or higher will give it problems. It can still have some issues with the special rules of embarked units. It doesn't get on so well with Kazakin, as they can't use their command phase order thing while embarked, I believe. And you could just run infantry up the board with move to get them where they need to be if you didn't want to pay for the transport premium. Still though, I'd say it's a solid enough unit as it is. I've chosen to score it an 8 out of 10 here. As a transport, I think it's actually fairly godly. It's just whether or not it makes sense to put units in it and run them up the board, as opposed to do things in other ways without bothering with transports. Otherwise, for a very cheap 65 points is the Taurox. Again, a very low investment transport vehicle, provides a little bit of autocannon fire and a Stormbolter, and it feels like a bit more of a no-frills bargain basement Chimera. It's a little bit faster and it has the ability to advance and drop if it makes sense to give up the autocannon shooting, but otherwise loses out on a fair few of the extra advantages that the Chimera has. It's only toughness 8 and has 10 wounds, has less firepower overall, no hunter-killer missile or firing deck, and the orders are a bit more awkward with this guy, seeing as you can't order from inside it. Between all that, that's quite a lot of losses compared with the Chimera for just 5 points. Overall, I still think they're kind of fine for what they do, I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10 overall. I feel like it'd be a bit more tempting if the Chimera didn't exist, but I feel like for 5 points differential, I'd much rather have the Chimera versus the Taurox right now. Finally, we've got the dedicated Scion transport that is the Taurox Prime. At 90 points, it's pretty significantly more expensive than the previous two, though it comes with a little bit more firepower. It can still pack some twin autocannon shots, and maybe the best top-mounted gun might be the Taurox missile launcher for a bit more mid-strength fire hitting on a 3+. Its special rule is that it allows you to reroll wound rolls for the disembarking units, something that could be genuinely kind of interesting with Scions getting out of it. They could be fully re-rolling hit rolls with melter guns and plasma guns, and then fully re-rolling wound rolls as well. Could be very nice for a squad, maybe a command squad and a regular unit tied together. It is locked to transporting Scions though, so just rely on them being kind of good, plus Scions already have deep strike to be able to get their special weapons in range if they need to. They wouldn't get the wound roll boosts, but that could equally get them there without having to pay an extra 90 points. I'd say that even with the upgunned weapons, it's still not particularly exciting in terms of overall damage and defense in itself, and between all that is a bit of a rarer sight to be seen on the table. Overall, I've chosen to rate it a 5 out of 10. Just seems like quite a big investment unit for something that's fairly fragile and relies on you building around on the board Scions without deep strike, maybe a bit more of an out there build. Next, we've got the Guard Flyer that is the Valkyrie. This one's 190 points for a premium air transport. It can hover so it can start on the board, and then basically pays for its 20-inch move, then drop a unit. So you could have an infantry squad get within special weapon range right from turn 1 if you wanted to. Its special rule is a kind of slightly weird situational rapid ingress style move, where you could get units out with grav shoots in the enemy's movement phase. I think in all honesty though, that one just doesn't work enormously well, plus you have to commit deep strike units within the Valkyrie itself, which sort of feels like a bit of a fluff move for Scions, but maybe not that great practically. Otherwise, its damage output is kind of bad, though its durability is okay for an aircraft. Toughness 10, a 2+ save, and 14 wounds could be worse, even if I wouldn't call it massively stand out at 190 points. I think the main issue for the Valkyrie is that it just doesn't really bring loads more than you couldn't get with a super cheap Chimera at 70 points. It definitely adds a bit more than a Chimera does, though I'd say probably not a lot more given it's 120 points more. For the cost, the damage output's very unexciting, and OC0 means no help for primaries either. I've chosen to score it a 4 out of 10. Maybe it could be worse if you wanted to deliver a super scary unit right to the front from turn 1, though I feel like the Guard maybe just don't have anything that's quite valuable enough to justify this sort of spend doing so. Next up, we've got the Aegis defense line, a fortification choice for 145 points for a big stretch of models. Previously a staple of generic 40k army lists, now the Guard version just gives you a 4+ invulnerable save to infantry taking shelter behind it, but it's just handy enough to have as a cover save that can stretch in the front of your deployment zone. Quite nice for tanks and things, maybe giving them a bit more freedom of positioning and not just having to cozy up to ruins. Unfortunately though, I think just literally providing cover saves and invulnerable saves to infantry for 145 points is far too much for what it does. It doesn't have any other abilities and it'll just sit there. What's perhaps the most surprising thing is that for the points it's not even really all that standout tough. If the opponent does have spare anti-tank firepower going and nothing better to shoot at, they could just hit this with a bunch of las cannon shots and take those saves out of the game for good. Overall, probably the most spectacularly overcosted thing in the Guard Codex right now. I've chosen to score it a 1 out of 10. Finally, for the core index, let's get into the character choices, and first up we have Lord Solar Leontus, Lord Commander of the Segmentum Solar, and pretty much the god of command and orders to the Astra Militarum. For 125 points, this guy brings some massive benefits, 3 orders that can be given to any Astra Militarum units, including unusual things like tank commanders, auxilia, and titanic units, and he can combine him with a command squad within an infantry squad variant, and then have those orders broadcast out through the Mastervox. So his really big order commands can be heard a great big 24 inches away. I think that would already be pretty spectacular, though he also generates you command points each turn as well. All very good for reliably being able to use reinforcements when you need it, and also get an additional one for other things. And then yet more, he can redeploy 3 units at the start of the game. Could just be nice to get a little bit of fine positioning on tanks and vehicles, perhaps making sure they can't be hit turn 1 but are still in a position to strike. And as it goes for the Guard, he's got some fairly punchy melee, somewhat equivalent to a Space Marine captain. He's not going to be soloing battle tanks on his own, but potentially could countercharge something like a squad of normal Space Marines really quite successfully. Overall, loads of benefits. Admittedly, he might well need a bit more investment, like buying a command squad and an infantry unit to protect him. And from there, you're likely not going to want to play too aggressively with him, given his big benefits, and keep him safe for as much of the game as possible. But overall, he does seem to be making his way into just about every Imperial Guard competitive list at this points cost. Between massive orders and free command points, it's hard not to score him a full 10 out of 10. Otherwise, for the officers, there's the Cadian Castellan, 45 points as a character that can either join the Cadian Shock Troops, Kazakin, or the Infantry Squad. He's quite cheap at 45 points, gives his unit an order plus sustained hits 1, which is rather nice. And then he does have quite the nice boost of allowing the units to fall back and shoot as well, something that isn't very common to have within the Guard Codex, and he's one of the only sources. I feel like between all that, he does add lots of value to his unit, is definitely fair enough to play. I think perhaps his biggest issue is that he's in competition with several other great officers, both named and generic, plus command squads. And I feel like maybe he might have been just a little bit more tempting if he could lead the Death Corps of Krieg, maybe feeling like they're the unit that you often want on the front lines if you're doing infantry squad damage dealing. They'd certainly like a way to be able to get fall back and shoot with all those special weapons. Overall solid enough though, I've chosen to rate him a 7 out of 10. Then we've got Ursula Creed, 55 points and taking up her father's mantle. She can also attach to the Cadian units, gives them 2 orders, and her own personal units can allow order stacking, so you could say have move, 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 and plus 1 ballistic skill on the go. As well as that, she gives them pretty big value by allowing 1 free battle tactic stratagem per turn. Could be quite nice to lay down fields of fire, debuffing more enemy targets to make all your AP better against that unit. Otherwise, she has a little bit of personal threat between her pistols and power sword, and could go alright with Kazakin squads maybe, giving them some bonus orders and battle tactics free. Being Cadian, she does have slightly more limited choice of units to lead, again no Death Corps or Caschans in there. There are plenty of other good officers, though it does seem that she makes the cut in quite a lot of competitive lists. 2 orders plus a free powerful stratagem each turn is rather hard to pass up. I choose to rate the power around 9 out of 10. Otherwise, for pretty standout good officers, there's Ironhand Strachan, 55 points for a Kaschan leader. He has 2 orders and grants lethal hits in melee to his unit, and then comes with just really quite brutal personal melee threat of his own, 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, but perhaps more importantly re-rolling all hit and wound rolls on the charge. And with a generalist damage profile like that, that is rather brutal. He's got a reasonable chance of killing a whole bunch of Space Marines if he charges in just personally, never mind if the rest of his squad manage to do anything. With the orders and being able to scout forward, it's not impossible he could even get first turn charges alongside his jungle fighters, could really surprise the enemy with move, move, move there. I think for 55 points, for the sheer amount of damage and problems that he can cause, he's rather good. For downside, I guess he is locked to Kaschan jungle fighters. It's a shame that the rest of the squad can't do just a little bit more damage lifting on their own. I suppose they do help out his personal melee though by making him go to strength 7 and AP 3 on the charge via their datasheet ability. He is likely to be carrying the squad in the damage game a bit. I still say that even with that good melee damage, it's only going to lift them to the point where they're tangling with sort of mid-level threats, as opposed to being able to charge down enemy elites or anything like that. But still really quite a fun, interesting and dangerous version of Katachans. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Trusty Command Squad. 60 points for the platoon version of the datasheet, or 65 points for the Cadian version. Again, they're often a very common competitive staple in army lists, due to being able to broadcast Lord Solar's orders far and wide over the master box. It means the orders can affect units that are 24 inches away. The squad itself also provides another order via the commander, and then the rest of the specialists in the unit also add their own value, the medic providing a 6+ feel no pain, the standard giving you some extra OC and being able to be a bit more resilient to battle shock. Then they also have their datasheet rules as well. The Cadian one allows ignore modifiers, and the platoon one allows you to use stratagems when you're battle shocked. Just having a few more bodies and extra special weapons isn't the worst thing ever in a big ranked up infantry unit either, and it can be quite a nice place to put in enhancements, maybe particularly Grand Strategist to throw out an extra order over the airwaves. Particularly in the context of Lord Solar's orders, it does mean that they're a pretty great little command bunker for him, alongside an infantry unit of some sort. Could be nice to have them guarding the home field objective, hiding from enemy firepower, and keeping up command and control of the rest of the units in your army. Overall, quite a nice support unit that I've chosen to rank a 9 out of 10 here. Certainly can be pretty handy for more Fort Guard Horde sort of playstyles as well. The feel no pain and orders and things are quite nice for a big massed up 20-man squad. Able to join the command squad are the regimental attaches for 40 points for the attached units. They add just a few more bodies. The astropath gives you a deep strike denial to 12 inches, but just for his model. The officer of the fleet are +1 to hit for the aeronautica units, but I feel like the main draw to include them in the army is the master of ordnance, giving you sustained hits 1 for a nominated target within 30 inches of him for any artillery units with blast weapons. I feel like the astropath is handy to have at the edge of the units, though it often might not stop an enemy from getting a 9-inch charge on the unit if they set up slightly away from him. The officer of the fleet is often irrelevant unless you're taking aeronautica stuff along, but quite a lot of guard army lists have at least some artillery in them, and the master of ordnance can give you another fairly powerful damage boost against one target. I guess the main issue with him though is that he needs to be able to see that target, and he also needs to declare that target early on in the shooting phase, both of which have some negatives. And he just might not really be able to put that debuff on the unit that the artillery actually want to shoot at. It does maybe risk over-investing a bit in the big command squad unit that's probably already a little bit overloaded, if the opponent is able to take it out, particularly if they're exposing themselves by having the master of the ordnance gain line of sight, then it could be big problems. Overall, definitely could be helpful though, if the ordnance man can actually get the debuff where it's needed. I've chosen to rate them a 6 out of 10 though, might be handy enough, though definitely don't feel anywhere near auto-include. Otherwise, for command squad attachments, there's the Ogren Bodyguard and Nork Deadog. 40 points for the regular Ogren Guard, 60 points for Nork. They can also attach to the command squad, and basically just add a big chunky muscled model with 6 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save, and a feel no pain for the regular Ogren Guard. Unfortunately though, due to the unit's majority toughness of 3, it does mean that the Ogren's toughness stat doesn't really apply. They do add a bit more melee threat to any unit with a command squad in. Nork gets you 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 with devastating wounds. The Ogren 1 can either choose a knife with a similar profile or to get the invulnerable save and have a more regular Bullgrim more. And both of them give you feel no pain type saves against officers to ward against precision attacks. I feel like both of these might just be slightly trying to push a unit in a weird kind of direction though. Best if you've got a command squad on the front lines, I guess. But even then, I feel like they don't add enormous amounts more for the 40 points or 60 points extra. They still don't really take the squad from being bad in combat to being good in close combat. And even with Nork's attacks, there's plenty of targets that just don't really care too much against his damage profile, anything with very high saves or very high toughness. Overall, I'd rate them both as just being maybe slightly more fun, include them being super exciting. Maybe if you had 40 points left over and a command squad that was going to plan to be on the front lines, as opposed to trying to stay safe. Finally, for command squad things, we've got the Tempestus Scion command squad. 80 points for the leaders of the Militarum Tempestus. They grant sustained hits to the unit, so a inbuilt damage buff. They can have a lot of special weapons in the unit or swap it out for the usual upgrades like medics, the standard, or the Master Vox. And I feel like they just got really quite a big boost out of the recent Guard Rules update. You can now issue orders after you've jumped out of, say, Taurox Primes or out of reserves, both of which are pretty relevant for these. I say their biggest weakness is that they're still very costly for a unit that's pretty easy to kill, kind of similar to the regular Scions, which aren't very durable. If you were trying to go big investment damage dealing and backing up a big unit of 10 Scions with them, the 15 model squad would cost 190 points, which is quite a lot. And special weapons do punch up well against certain targets, but maybe less so against anything that they're going to be wounding on a 5+. I still rate these guys as kind of niche, but far less bad than they would have been before. I've chosen to rate them a 6 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the iconic Guard Commissar, 30 points, so really quite a cheap character. He makes his own squad a bit more resilient to battle shock, leadership 6, and gets 2 reroll battle shock tests if there's an officer in the same unit, plus his feared summary execution rule, blamming 1 infantry model to remove the effects of battle shock, done at the start of a phase once per battle round. Perhaps the biggest issue with his battle shock cancelling things, though, are that the actual cancel battle shock rules won't be helpful for scoring objectives most of the time for primaries, as in general you test battle shock midway through the command phase, and then you score primaries at the end of the command phase, and there's no phase start between those two to cancel the failed test. You'd also need to have the right sort of army list to really consider bringing him along. I don't think he's really all that great if he's just literally supporting 1 unit. You need to have him at the centre of, say, a bunch of infantry squads moving forward, so playing some sort of foot guard playstyle perhaps. Currently I feel like for 30 points for the borderline battle shock things that he offers, just not really very worth it. If battle shock was more meaningful or punishing, then perhaps he would be a bit more so. Currently though, I've chosen to rank the Commissars a 4 out of 10, a bit more of a fun and fluff choice as opposed to a competitive one. Next up, for 60 points, there's the Primaris Psyker, a 2+ chance to get a 4+ invulnerable save on his unit, potentially quite good for, say, that 20-man Krieg block build, with a 4+ invulnerable and the Feel No Pain from their Marshal. And it is quite handy that that activates in the enemy shooting phase as opposed to in your own command phase or anything like that, so it can be done in reaction to the enemy getting first turn. Otherwise, Psychic Maelstrom is generally fairly savage damage for a single guard character at range. Quite nice to basically give you more of the same for any special weapons that you happen to have in the unit already. Again, that one pairs quite well with Deathcore of Krieg, with taking big casualties in the squad. If you can get a +1 to hit and wound on that profile, it becomes pretty scary against most things in the game. Otherwise, he has just a little bit of melee and a 4+ save against psychic attacks. For major issues, he has the chance to destroy himself both with hazardous rolls for Psychic Maelstrom and the perils from Psychic Barrier, so 2 ways to blow up your own Psyker there. Feels kind of appropriately unreliable for mortal Psykers in 40k. He is maybe a bit dependent on big blocks of infantry being efficient as the way to play to make him good, which they aren't really taken in big numbers at the moment, and his invulnerable save is really quite big against anything that had a fair amount of AP and was reducing your saves to 0. Though if you were just being hit by loads of AP 0 things and you had cover, it might make very little difference, if anything. Overall, I still think he's a pretty solid buffing character for foot guard armies though. I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10. Next up is the servant of the machine god that is the Regimental Engineer. 45 points for a little guy who gets lone operative next to vehicles, healing them D3 wounds and granting the same vehicle a 4+ invulnerable save for the next battle round. Between these two abilities, if you're taking anything that's Baneblade sized, then 45 points seems near auto-include for that. The healing is just really quite good just by itself, but the invulnerable save really makes them a massive pain to deal with. I feel like any other bigger vehicles out there could be kind of tempting for the same thing as well. A Vogel Dawn battle tank also seems like a pretty solid option. He has surprisingly good melee damage for a little support character as well. Can be going up to 7 attacks at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2 in melee if a nearby vehicle is slain at some point. And his lone operative protection can sometimes allow him to get to unusual places without being threatened. Could be an okay one to have on objectives. Overall, for downsides, I think he is generally good value, but I suppose he's adding defense and durability, but not actual damage compared with just dedicating the points to more actual damage dealing vehicles and things. And a fair bit of the time between cover and 2+ armor saves, the 4+ invulnerable save might actually make less difference than you might expect. You need to be being hit by AP -4 things for it to come into effect if you got cover. He also could struggle to keep up with certain vehicles if they decide to go moving quickly into the midfield with move. So it's maybe a bit better for things that are either going to rumble along slowly and keep their distance a little bit, or at least do so for most of the game. In any case though, I still think it's worth the points. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10. If you're taking a Baneblade or Super Heavy, I would take one along. Next up, we've got some Zealot with some Rosary Beads in the Regimental Preacher. He's 35 points as an infantry melee buffing character, and his boost is to give sustained hits in melee for guard infantry units, plus a little bit of personal melee in himself with a power weapon potentially. In a different army, maybe he'd be usable, but he just doesn't really have any good melee units to lead in the Astra Militarum. I guess the Kaschan Jungle Fighters are as close as you get, but with only 1 attack at strength 4 AP 1, and that's only when they charge in, they're really not much to write home about. If you're going to boost their damage as well, you're better off with Strachan. Perhaps if he could lead Bulgrin, he might have people take a second look, but otherwise he just seems to be just not very good at the moment. I've chosen to rate him a 2 out of 10. Next up, we've got Sergeant Harker for 40 points. He can join the Kaschan Jungle Fighters and tries to make them into a bit more of a ranged unit. He adds a Ballistic Skill 3 Heavy Bolter payback, and he can fire that accurately on the move, having 1 round of big damage per game where he gets to fire twice and get sustained hits 3, so really quite a big upgrade there. As well as that, he provides an order for his Jungle Fighters and has a -1 to hit for the lead units at greater than 12 inches range, so makes the squad just a little bit more durable. Overall, he is really quite a cheap character and kind of fun. The Heavy Bolter will chip away at enemy units a bit over the course of the game. I feel like his biggest weakness is being tied to the Jungle Fighters themselves though, which aren't really units that lend themselves to being good at long range. They only have a bunch of las guns and then everything else wants to be closer with flamers, plus their scout special rule means they want to often go into the midfield and just be cheap efficient screens without extra character baggage weighing them down. Given that the melee powerhouse that is Iron Hand Strachan just adds really quite a lot more to the unit, I'd be a lot more tempted to take him along versus Harker. I don't think he's awful, but fairly outcompeted, and it will be a bit of an unusual choice for people to look for. I've chosen to rank him a 5 out of 10 overall. Next up, for 65 points, we have the man, the legend that is Sly Marbo himself. He's a cheap lone operative infantry character, which is just generally a good start, as they're handy to have in Warhammer 40k. Just quite good to have Loki around for a unit that the enemy can't touch at longer range, and then can potentially do annoying things with screening or objectives. He brings a whole bunch of Strength 5, AP -1 and Damage 2 attacks that hit on a 2+ between the Ripper Pistol and his Venom Blade. If the enemy shoots him or a unit nearby him, then he gets to fire back with a Ripper Pistol, which he could potentially do multiple times, and he also gets the ability to move after shooting, which could be after he does one of those reactive shots. For downsides, if the enemy can hit him with something meaningful, then he's not that hard to kill. His damage output's really going to fall flat against certain armies and targets. He really needs to be trying to find some at least fairly valuable infantry to kill. I feel like in the Astra Militarum he'll be competing against Gaunt's Ghosts in particular, who are fairly godly lone operatives, plus the assassins like the Calidus Assassin. I feel like in general these guys tend to be played a bit more competitively versus Sly. Maybe if those other options weren't as good or didn't exist, he'd be a bit more prominent, but I feel like given the competition it makes him pretty niche. I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10 overall. Finally, from the datasheets from the mainline index, we have Gaunt's Ghosts. Abraham Gaunt leads his band of 5 misfits into battle, and in general are a very interesting utility unit. Lone operative protection, but very tough for a lone operative at 13 wounds with stealth and automatic cover from those camo cloaks. Even if the enemy can catch up with something, they're going to need some fairly dedicated firepower to bring down all of them. They have the rule where they get to go off the board and then reappear anywhere that's just greater than 9 inches away from the foe. That's really pretty great for secondaries or pressuring isolated enemy infantry units. They have 2 orders and got a big boost to this. Now they can issue them as soon as they've turned up from reserve. Means that you can have either extra survivability or extra damage output each time they turn up, or other things if needed. They can chip away with a couple of meaningful guns with Bragg's autocannon and Larkin's long last, and if they get charged in combat, they don't have loads of melee threat, but can fight first with a whole bunch of strength 3 melee attacks. You might at least have the chance to kill 1 or 2 models before they get the wrath of the enemy unit that attacks them. Perhaps their biggest downside is their damage output just isn't really all that focused or standout, though it doesn't really need to be. They can be jumping on and off the board, doing objectives, and getting at damage on things that are most critical, and feel like a fairly easy include in most armies. I guess you'd weigh them up against a Calidus Assassin, being a lot easier to kill, but also having that debuff a stratagem rule. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10, a very strong competitive unit, I think. Finally, compared with most armies, the Astra Militarum has a fair complement of things from Forge World in their Imperial Armor Index, maybe mostly a little bit on the mediocre side, but there are a few very powerful datasheets lurking within there. One of them certainly the Death Corps Field Marshal, a 60-point character for an order, a cancel battle shock, and most importantly a 5+ feel no pain type save that makes Death Corps units just very hard to kill, particularly with the regenerating models. I'd say he's one of the better Forge World datasheets, and I'd rate him an 8 out of 10. Otherwise, there's the Death Rider Squadron Commander, who can give the Death Rider Squadron infiltrate, the Death Riders being a mounted unit very similar to the Rough Riders, but not getting the Melter Lances, and instead just getting a bunch of Strength 4, AP 1 and Damage 1 attacks, their advantage being a reactive move compared with the Attilan Rough Riders. I'd say overall the Strength 4 and AP 1 does hold them back a bit, just means they're not really that much of a threat to anything with a good save or high toughness. The Hades Breaching Drill has maybe seen better days, 110 points to turn 2 Deep Strike, an infantry unit in Strategic Reserve. I don't think that that's worth the massive price tag for it, and it's not exactly guaranteed to make a charge, so it could just sit there with its fancy Melter Cutter drill and then the enemy just kills it. I gave that one a 3 out of 10. For the Trojan support vehicle, as a slight oddity of the armor front within Forge World, and maybe have a bit more of a time for that one. It functions maybe a little bit like the regimental engines here, healing D3 wounds and giving you reroll hit rolls of 1 for one vehicle. That could be fun on something like a Baneblade or a Super Heavy. In general though, for the cheaper points cost, people seem to prefer the regimental engines here over that thing. The invulnerable save and costing far less seems like the better value trade-off overall. The planes I feel like just aren't particularly exciting right now. There's the Avenger, Thunderbolt, Voss Lightning, and Vulture gunship, all with different combinations and quantities of weapons. The actual strike fighter type aircraft, they have to start off the board, so are relegated to kind of beta strike sort of role. The Vulture gunship can start on the board, though like the Valkyrie, its damage output just seems to be at a massive premium at 225 points. I'm not a particularly big fan of the enormous Marauder, Destroyer and Bomber planes either, at least rules-wise. They're big and scary 20 wound Forge World flyers, again needing to start off the board. They do have a fair bit of firepower and could be kind of hard to take down unless you can focus loads of guns on them, though their bombing rules still don't work very well. Locked flight paths and just being ridiculously enormous models to position on the table could give them problems. I feel like overall the datasheets here just aren't really quite strong enough to build around. I've ranked them really quite low. I guess all of them do get a bit better damage output with the officer of the fleet if you can have one or more on the board. That maybe just feels like trying to throw more investment after something that already isn't already that great. For the non-Titanic artillery pieces, there's the Earthshaker carriage at 120 points, a Basilisk platform that hits on a 5+ rather than a 4. There's also a mobile and less tough than the Basilisk is. It is a little bit cheaper and still hands out the big movement debuff though, so I still think it's fairly usable. I would personally rate the Basilisk over this though for the extra 15 points. Being able to move around if needed and better overall damage output per point, I feel like is enough to swing the two. For 110 points, there's a Medusa carriage. Now the Manticore got bumped up to 180 points. I feel like these things might come to the fore a bit more. D6 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 is pretty threatening against most targets. It's not really too much to ask for 110 points, I think, particularly with all the guard artillery buffs that you can get. I feel like they might be perhaps the single strongest actual damage dealer artillery piece now, and I'd rate them a 9 out of 10. And then there's the slightly odd profile for the Colossus Bombard at 160 points, strength 6, AP 1 and damage d6 plus 2, but also has anti-vehicle and anti-monster 5+ and devastating wounds, giving you at least some chance of a big damage d6 plus 2 through against your targets that your opponent can't do much about. Kind of fun if a slightly weird unit for 160 points. I'd probably be more tempted by other artillery platforms like the Basilisk or Manticore over this. I chose to rate it a 6 out of 10. The Cyclops Demolition Vehicle is a 25-point rolling bomb that moves 8 inches and then can blow up for D3 mortal wounds for a unit within 3 inches. The damage is kind of bad for its points cost, though it could be weirdly handy for screening or secondary objectives. The Valkyrie tanks, unfortunately, I still think are rather overcosted, basically like the Rogel Dawn, but worse, really. A similar sort of overall defensive profile to the Rogel Dawn, but just kind of lackluster stats and not as threatening big guns. The Valdor Tank Hunter with its neutron laser is 285 points. At this kind of price tag, it just needed a far more threatening main gun. I feel like Games Workshop just gave it good strength and AP stats, but the damage means that it doesn't really do much more than a las cannon. The Rapier laser batteries are fairly okay anti-tank, 2 shots at strength 12, AP 2 and damage d6 plus 1 for each 35-point gun are quite nice. As anti-tank they're not awful, though they are wanting to stay still and they're kind of fragile if the enemy shoots them. I'd rate them a 6 out of 10, but could be at least fairly threatening. And the Tarantula battery is 40 points each, with an immobile sentry gun with either a twin las cannon or heavy bolter that can get free overwatch. Definitely adds a fun little dimension, though the damage output is kind of low for what they are. Finally, for the really big super heavy Titanic type things, there's the Crassus Armored Transporter. That's 18 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save. It doesn't really do damage, but it could transport an awful lot of infantry of one sort or another up the board. Potentially it could be kind of fun for a whole bunch of Ogren jumping out with Ripper guns within 9 inches and giving them reroll to wounds. The Macarius series of tanks are 285 points or more. They are Titanic tough tanks with toughness 13 and 20 wounds. They are hard to kill, but unfortunately just for all their main gun stats, the damage output is just very bad when compared with Lehman Russ's or Rogel Dawn's. The Praetor is 275 points for an enormous artillery piece. If you can order it, then it will be hitting on a 2+ with its multi-launcher, and it can vary up its loadout depending on whether or not you want to strike against tanks and vehicles or against lighter stuff. I still feel like its points costs are probably going to be better off with things like Basilisks or Medusas for the same weight in points though. I guess one advantage is that it is very tough with a big 18 wounds and 2+ save, going to be extra hard to take out. I've rated that one a 5 out of 10. Perhaps for the Gem of the Forge World Super Heavies, I did mention it earlier briefly, but the Stormblade for 415 points is quite nice for a big scary strength 10 damage 4 plasma gun. He gets to reroll hit rolls within half range for the main gun, which is nice, plus it just gets all the other las cannons and heavy bolters and things as a standard Baneblade chassis, and it's cheaper than any of the index ones. I've chosen to rank that as a 7 out of 10. Could be pretty problematic for some enemies to deal with, perhaps a little bit terrain dependent though. Finally, the Carnodon is 160 points, maybe best as a las cannon machine with the top las cannon and sponsons. It does compete kind of poorly against Ross's for 160 points though. I feel like this would have to lose a good 20 points before people would start looking at it very seriously. There we have it though, with the Forge World units talked about. That just about brings us to the end of Index Astra Militarum and the units within. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions or any other different ways of using the units talked about down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing any insights from you guard collectors out there. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure I'll have more for the Emperor's army in time. Finally, if you have been enjoying videos like this on the channel and want to help support new ones coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.